Hello, everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week on the show, we're talking the Arena Open Sealed event. We're going to do some prep for that, talk about Sealed, talk about the format, some big picture Sealed thoughts, some big picture Streets New Capenna Sealed thoughts. I'm going to be talking about my experience playing Sealed. I've done about 5 or 6 Sealed pools so far, in addition to, stuff previously this week, and I've done a lot of Seals with other people in coaching sessions and also just with my friends. So I've got a decent amount of experience with the format itself. I also just want to touch on Sealed as a big picture concept because it doesn't get a lot of love. Usually we get to talk about Sealed around this time when there's an Arena Open because that's mostly when it's relevant. But Sealed's kind of this underdeveloped skill, I would say. It's almost like, when you have to go to the dentist and you're like, uh-oh, I haven't flossed very much lately, and you floss 7 times in a row to compensate the day before. It's kind of like that where everybody tries to get their Sealed prep in right before the actual event, and that can work. It's definitely better than nothing, but I think exercising and trying to understanding a wide breadth of generalizable Sealed skills is something that I would like to try to share today. So let's jump into it. Before we do, of course, got to shout out to the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That is the number one place that you can go if you want to support the show. Or, honestly, if you want to support any of my content, that's the number one place you can go. Support me, support all the stuff I do. There's a bunch of rewards over there on the Patreon tiers. I think we've got about 5, 6 different tiers of rewards, ranging from Discord benefits to coaching benefits to deck tech and draft log review benefits. A lot of stuff over there, help you get better as a limited Magic player. And particularly pertaining to this episode, we've got the Corridor classes going on, which are weekly classes that I hold for my patrons over on a private server that we meet weekly. This week, we're going to be going over Sealed pools. We're going to be doing builds together. There's a lot of group activities that we do. It's usually a class of about 10, 11, generally. This week, we're going to be, dividing into groups, doing some builds, see what people come up with, talk about those builds, go a little bit deeper on the topics that we're talking about today. And we get to pick my brain, pick the brains of a lot of other smart people over there. So check that out if that's interesting to you. I really am proud of what we've put together over there. The community we've built. Everybody who joins those classes say they have a really good time. And hope you can join. As I said, that's over on the Patreon if you want to check that out. Okay, so let's just jump into the episode. Big Pig, I actually put here. Big picture. Why did I put Big Pig? Big picture Sealed tip. So let's jump into this. The number one Sealed tip that I can give you, and I can give a player that maybe is newer to Sealed or doesn't have a lot of Sealed experience, is a very simple tip. Play the good cards and don't play the bad cards. I know this sounds obvious, and as I've done my Sealed episodes in the past, this is the number one thing I say, I think, on every single episode, but I really want to stress this. Play your good cards and don't play your bad cards. And what I mean by this is Sealed is generally a slower format by a little bit. I don't want to say it's slower by a lot. I think often when people hear, oh, Sealed is a bit slower, they think it's like this big grind fest. And, there can be games that come down to a grind fest, but I would say on average, it's like a turn and a half slower than a normal game. Or, sorry, I should say compared to a draft game. And because of this, you kind of want all of your cards to be good at every single part of the game. And what that means is you want to have fewer bad 2-drop and 3-drop creatures that are just kind of filling the curve there. Like Broker, Veteran, 2/1 blue creature that dies and puts a shield counter on something. Just, you don't need to put bad cards in your deck to fill out that early part of the curve because you're not going to be under that much pressure as often. Now, you still want to play the good cheap cards. That is something that I would love to put in my deck. Good cheap cards. But there is a distinction between good cheap cards like Civil Servant, even Backup Agent, the 2-mana 1/1 that puts a counter on something, and those kind of junky ones I was talking about. Also, Sealed is just generally less synergistic, right? And so that means that there might be some cards you would play in draft because you go, hey, this card has a lot of synergy in my deck, and I've kind of built around that. I think there's actually a little bit less of that in this set, to be honest. There's some standout cards I'm going to talk about in a second, but you want every single card in your deck to stand alone as a good card. Because, as I was saying, the games can go a little bit long, and if your opponent is drawing cards that are all impactful cards, good removal spells, beefy creatures, relevant bodies, and you're drawing your stupid, Backstreet Bruiser, 2-mana 3/3 defender, that's going to lose you the game, lose you a lot of games. And with that, avoid cards that don't stand on their own, right? Something like Pyre Sludge Arsonist, 3 mana 2/2, tap it, pay 1, you can deal X damage to something where X is the number of permanents you've sacked. Sticky Fingers, it's Menace Aura that makes treasures. Patch Up is another card that you're like, okay, well, all these cards, you can imagine them having a place in your deck. You're like, oh, okay, like I've got some sacrifice stuff in here. I got some, my Patch Up, which is the thing that reanimates 3 mana value worth of creatures. I've got a few good creatures to get back. Those are the kind of cards that, number one, it's just harder to enable those cards because, you just don't get your choice of what you open. But two, you really got to make sure that every point of the game, all of the cards you draw are going to they're going to be consistent, right? They're not like, well, sometimes this is good. Sometimes I have the sacrifice, the treasures going on. Sometimes I don't. That's just not a luxury you have in a lot of your sealed pools. Now, I will caveat this with saying there are exceptions. There are certainly sealed pools that I could construct, and I'm like, oh, hey, Pyre Sludge Arsonist, that's an okay card in this deck, right? Or Sticky Fingers, maybe you open up the rare, really good aggro deck, and I think that is very rare, especially in this format. But I really want to caution that, unlike Draft, where you can kind of make lemonade out of lemons, or you're like, okay, maybe these aren't such good cards, but I can kind of piece together some synergies. That doesn't happen as much in Sealed, and it's kind of, I think, as much as I am an optimist, and when it comes to, life and Magic in general, I'm like, well, this card could be pretty good in my deck. That's not something that that's not a piece of optimism or a place I want to put my optimism. Sealed is not the place for that, I would say. And on top of this, since there is more fixing in the format than in a regular format, or even just a regular sealed format, you can play fewer bad cards. There's a bunch of lands you're going to open. A big part of each pool in this format is seeing what lands you have, right? Seeing your 10, 11 lands or whatever it is. Also, you have the family of fixing creatures. There's a few more sources in there. If you can put in, 23 good cards instead of 17 good cards and 6 bad cards, think of all those games that you're just not going to draw those 6 bad cards, and think of how many games you're going to win, how many more games, because you'll have all those good cards, right? I have a little note at the bottom here that says, it's better to have good cards than to have perfect mana. So I've been stressing a lot in this draft format that you got to have clean mana. You can't be the straight 3 colors. You don't want to be splashing around. You want to find some sort of 2-color base. I think those principles still apply to Sealed. I don't want to throw them out the window. But if you're going to, if you look at it on a spectrum of power versus clean mana, you can just tilt that spectrum, or like push the needle, the die a little bit towards slightly rougher mana or slightly stretched mana for the sake of having those good cards, so that you don't have to play those last 6 very bad cards. Now, I really, really hesitate with this point, because I don't want people to go just buck wild with this. I still think it means you should have a good mana base. Make sure you have the lands to support the cards you're trying to cast. All of the, the 3 sources for 1 card, 4 sources for 2 cards, whatever it is, your general fixing rules, those still all apply. I think the main difference compared to Draft is that you just have a little bit more time to find your sources. So one of the pressures in this Draft format to not play a lot of creatures, not play a lot of colors, is you don't have a lot of time to find those colors. In multicolored draft sets of the past, you had a lot of time. I'm thinking, Khans of Tarkir, Shards of Lara, those, these boomer formats at this point. You kind of had some time to set up. Maybe you didn't have all your colors right away. That's not the case for this format, because there is a lot of good 2-drops in the format, and you get pressured. That's going to happen a little bit less often in Sealed, because you can't just always open 5, 6, 7 good 2-drops, right? So you're still going to want to adhere to having enough sources in your deck to cast the cards you're trying to cast. Just know that you have a little bit more time to find it. That's really the nuanced way to put it. The place where this whole play the good cards, don't play the bad cards really manifests, and the first time you're going to feel this is when you're building your pool and sorting your pool. And I think that I'm going to get to some sorting your pool, just heuristics, or not heuristics, but just some general sorting your pool practices later on. But the first thing I think you should do when you look at your pool in this format, in any sealed format, separate the cards that matter and the ones that don't. Right? I've got here on screen for people that are listening audio only. I've kind of just separated the cards in the board of every color that I just would prefer not to play, and then I've put the cards in my main deck here that I care about. my lands, and then I've separated by color, and multicolor is just the cards. Like, kind of get used to a lay of the land. I like these cards. I would prefer if these cards were in my deck, you know? And so, if you can do this and kind of get this is a good way to get a good sense of what your pool's doing, where your strongest pulls are. You could also just look at your rares. Your rares are a big part of play the good cards. I would really encourage playing your rares if you can, if that wasn't obvious. Like, one of the big things about playing your good cards is trying to play as many rares as you can. Sealed is a lot about rares. Sealed is a lot about who can stick their rare and whose rare goes unanswered. And I felt that in this format quite a bit. So I think that if you just separate, these good cards from the bad cards, that's your initial good starting point. Okay, so you might be asking, what are the cards that matter? Because the matter versus don't matter, kind of nebulous. That's very much like, well, I'm expecting you, the listener, to know what matters and what doesn't matter. And to answer that question, I've kind of got these big three categories, these big buckets, right? These 3 buckets of cards that you want to put in your sealed decks. So, number 1, interaction and removal spells. This is unlike in draft, where, if you ask me how important is removal in Streets of New Capenna draft, I would say moderately so. You need some, you want some, but it's not the absolute necessity that it might have been in Crimson Vow or some other formats where, you absolutely need to answer some bomb every single draft in the draft format. In Sealed, it's a little bit different because you're just more likely to see good rares, because instead of looking from 3 packs, every player is looking at 6 packs. And they're going to be playing their best cards from those 6 packs. And that's just going to more often be rares. And especially because you can't often tempo your opponent out, or it is less likely that you will be able to tempo your opponent out to the point where the bombs don't matter. You're going to need to find some way to answer some problematic permanent, right? A Titan of Industry or an All-Seeing Arbiter. Those ones are kind of hard to answer, to be fair. But the colors that you're choosing to put as your main colors in your deck, those often are going to be the ones with interaction spells in them. Or, conversely, you're splashing for these interaction spells. You've got stuff like, Murder, where I think that card is medium in draft, I think does get quite a bit better in Sealed. Even something like Killshot, where Killshot's not a card in my white decks I care very much about in my draft decks because, hey, I've got this good flying evasive creature plan. That's not going to come together as often in Sealed, and so you need to have just those Killshot, those kill something at some point kind of cards. Make Disappear is a good example of a really good catch-all interaction spell. One that I don't want to say it's better in Sealed than it is in draft. I think there's pros and cons there, where it's like Make Disappear plays really well in a tempo game plan where you can get ahead, stay ahead. But also in Sealed, it's a little bit better because counter spells are kind of these catch-alls, but also it's a soft counter spell where it's kind of dead in the late game. So, better in some places in Sealed, worse in some places in Sealed, averages out to still a pretty darn good interaction spell in Sealed, one that I really want. And then Rooftop Nuisance, right? Stuff like Rooftop Nuisance, which is the tap something down, casualty, draw a card, the thing doesn't untap. If you don't have these hard removal spells in your pool, you still need to interact in some way, and maybe your game plan is a little bit less, try to answer my opponent's best card, and it's tilted a little bit towards get on board early, tap my opponent's stuff down, try to get in for, try to approximate some sort of tempo game plan. And that's a big picture thing about Sealed pools too. It's every deck is going to play a little bit differently. Some decks are going to just play this classic limited magic. I've got some removal spells. I've got some big creatures. I'm going to be able to go toe-to-toe, grind with my opponent, got some card advantage. You have to ask yourself, do you have that kind of pool? If you don't have interaction spells that can cleanly kill a creature, you're probably going to want to lean a little bit towards, okay, I'm including some cards that are there to, some cheap flyers, which, you're going to be playing the good cheap flyers in this format anyways because those are just good cards. But maybe shift a little bit away from long-term card advantage and a little bit more towards ending the game. Second bucket here, quality creatures, ways to end the game. I think this is a maybe undervalued part of building your sealed pool. So often when you build your sealed pool, people are drawn to, well, the rares number one, of course, and the rares, good rare creatures fall into this bucket big time for sure. But often, just like I was just talking about, interaction spells and removal spells are big pulls into a color or a color pair in Sealed. So, but I think what gets undervalued a little bit is quality creatures and ways to end the game. Because a sealed pool full of removal spells can kind of end up in spots where if you face another sealed pool full of removal spells and you've got 9 good threats or something like that, well, 7 of those, or maybe, 7 of those good threats get killed, or a few of them get blanked virtually by your opponent's blockers, and then you actually have a pretty tough time closing out the game, even though you have good interaction. So, what are you looking for? Obviously, the Jewel Thief, the Inspiring Overseers, the good cards. Anything that you know is a good card in draft, like an actively good card, is probably going to be a good card in sealed, right? I was kind of cautioning against the ones that are passable in draft, but not so good in sealed, the kind of cheaper, dorkier things. Those are the one you want to lean away from. But anything that's obviously good in draft is going to be mostly good in sealed. What changes a little bit is stuff like the Family Fixers, the cycle of 3 mana or 3 color large, big expensive creatures in each family, Glamorous Outlaw, Sparse Adjudicators, this kind of card. That's the kind of card that I'm really actually looking to play in my sealed decks. These are the kind of cards that I'm happy to see in my pool, both because they fix and they are meaningful bodies. They're bodies that matter. Freelance Muscle is the 5 mana 4/4 that gets plus X, where X is the greatest power among creatures you control, or power and toughness, sorry, I should say. This is the kind of card that in draft, I'm like, yeah, kind of just like big dummy. I'm not so into it. But in sealed, this is like, wow, the game's gone a little bit longer. This is a card that matters. Again, going to that this matters talk, right? My opponent has to respect this. They're not going to be able to, just like, the problem with this card in draft is they can just out-tempo it a little bit. They can go, all right, I got my streamlined flyer plan or my streamlined tempo plan. You play a 5-drop dummy and it's like, all right, whatever. But in this set, or in sealed, that happens a little bit less often, where they don't have that streamlined plan as often. In a big old, 8/8, 5 and 8/8 pretty much does demand an answer, or demands you to interact with it or plan your game plan around it in some way. And I think that, they go hand in hand, right? Good interaction and good creatures. If you have good interaction, you're going to be able to leverage your creatures better, and vice versa. If you have good creatures, your interaction spells go a little bit further, because instead of just casting interaction spells on your opponent's creatures to, buy time and kill some stuff, you're actually pushing damage. So this is very similar to draft too. I'm not saying this doesn't apply to draft, but I'm breaking it down to the most basic terms here, right? Also, I should say, I forgot to mention this when I was talking about removal spells, but in sealed, be very careful about what you choose to interact with, right? Because in draft, often you can't afford for your opponent to play a 3 mana creature. You've held 3 mana up, and you can't afford to not murder the creature, right? They play a Jewel Thief on 3. You don't have any other play. Maybe you didn't have a 2-drop in that hand. You kind of just have to kill it. Maybe that's the case in your sealed games, right? Maybe that's the case. You go, okay, well, my hand's a pretty clunky hand. I should just murder their 3-drop. But use some, really deliberate on that. Because if you murder their 3-drop, they've probably got some sort of bomb lurking in their deck that you really, really would have liked an interaction spell to kill that. You would have preferred to kill their 5-drop bomb or their 6-drop bomb, whatever it is. Especially because you're not often going to be under as much pressure, like I was saying. You can maybe afford to take a few hits from that Jewel Thief. So just that's one of the big differences between seal and draft. And then the last thing here, card advantage. So this is the third big bucket. Cards that, accrue value in some way, whether that be the great ones, like Inspiring Overseer, the classically good ones in draft, or some of the most improved cards in sealed, I believe, are stuff like Rogue's Gallery, Demon's Duke, Haste the Joint. Rogue's Gallery is the 3 mana, you can get back a creature from your yard of each color. Demon's Duke is the 4 mana, instant, scry 2, draw 2, you lose 2. Haste the Joint, 4 mana, instant, draw 2, then look at each player's library, top card of each player's library. I don't love these cards. Rogue's Gallery is the exception. I think this was actually a pretty big improvement, compared to draft. Demon's Due and Haste the Joint, less so, but I'm not embarrassed to play these cards. Like in draft, I'm kind of embarrassed to play these cards. You just don't want to. Again, this is where tempo comes in, where you don't have time to cast these. But in sealed, if you're just trading off early stuff, you do want a way to grind, you do want a way to push through the early game. Ideally, your card advantage comes in rares or Inspiring Overseer or good cards like that, right? I would classify these, Demon's Due, Haste the Joint, as good filler cards, where your filler cards aren't those crappy 2s and 1s I was talking about. Instead, they're these kind of cards. These are the kind of cards that will matter in more games of sealed than those crappy early drops. Okay, and then a big question I get asked a lot, and I think people have about sealed, and just wondering how the games play out, is do aggro decks exist? Should you respect them? Yes and no. Like, you're going to face an aggressive deck once in a while. It's going to happen. It's less common in sealed, of course, because in draft you can really, customize how your deck's looking and pick up a bunch of 2-drops. You don't always have the luxury of that in sealed. You just can't. You're gifted what you're gifted, and that's that. But some people's pools, especially in this format where there's quite a few good 2s in some pools, especially like green-white, I think has a lot of pools where you can just build a good green-white aggressive deck, where that's going to happen, and you're going to have to account for that. Now, the sealed open this weekend is best of 1. So, the question there is, do you kind of lean your build towards maybe facing an aggro deck once in a while? I don't think so, because I think you're better off just facing or planning to face or expecting that you're going to face one of these later game decks that I'm talking about, or mid-rangey grindy decks. You're going to get gotten sometimes by those cheap aggro decks, and that's kind of just that. I think that's just the calculus, though, right? If you are building to kill these aggro decks, or to not die against these aggro decks, you're going to be less advantaged or have a worse matchup against what the larger part of the field is going to be, right? Which is these mid-rangey decks. And so maybe you put up a bruiser, a backstreet bruiser in your deck to hedge against an aggro deck. Well, that backstreet bruiser is not going to be that good against the mid-rangey deck, like I was saying. Now, as yourself, as the drafter, or as the sealed builder, should you build an aggro deck in your sealed pool if the deck is there? Yes, I would say that's a viable thing to do. I will very much caution, though, you need to be sure that your aggro deck is a good aggro deck, because a bad aggro deck in sealed is very, very bad. It's not going to do well. You need to have, 5, 6, 7 2-drops. You need to be gifted those. Those need to be in your pool. A bad aggro deck is going to be completely creamed by a good mid-range deck. So often when people stress don't draft or don't play aggro decks in your sealed pool, or don't try to build a aggro deck out of your sealed pool, that is with the thought that most sealed pools can't support that. The thing is, though, if you do have a very good aggro deck, it just looks like a draft deck, you're probably going to be advantaged over those people dirtling a little bit, trying to, set up their tap land, set up their family fixers, stuff like that. So really, maybe check with a friend, put it in, maybe even the limited level ups Discord, whatever limited Discord that you frequent. Say, hey, is this an actual good aggro deck, or am I just, kind of wishful thinking here? And, if it's an actual good aggro deck, sure, run it. If that's the best deck in your pool. If it's not the best deck in your pool, and you're like, oh, I want to try to get under the, kind of like next leveling yourself, I want to get under the more grindy decks, I don't know if that's a great idea, personally. I think you should just play whatever you think is the best deck. And if that you think is the best deck, sure, run that. But, that's a judgment call you're going to have to make. Okay, to move us into our next section here, I want to have some words from our good friend Reed Duke here. And he posted an article a few weeks back, which was awesome. It was, I think it was called, Top Ways to Get Better, Improve Your Game as a Magic Player. It was one of my favorite articles I've read in quite some time. I can post it in the show links, or the show notes. One of the things he talked about was sealed. And one of the things he said was, you don't need something special to win in your sealed deck. And I think this is very much true, and I think this is kind of a trap that people fall into, or just like a headspace they get into. And I'm just going to read this, not verbatim, but here's some of his thoughts here. He says, it's common to feel discouraged as you're the builder or playing a sealed deck, and you say, my opponents are going to have bomb rares, I don't, so I'm going to lose. Maybe you open a pool with no bombs. I was just talking about having, opening pools, and, bombs are great. I'm not gonna try to discount how good bombs are, but it's very easy to open a pool with no awesome standout cards and go, well, how am I going to win, right? My opponents are going to have good cards and I'm not going to. And, you're probably disadvantaged in some degree. You would love to have that Sanctuary Warden, but as Reed says here, matches of Magic aren't decided by comparing the best cards in the deck with each other, right? It's not just you flip over the decks and you see whose deck's better. You're going to be mulliganing. Your opponent's going to be mulliganing. Games are complex. You have sideboarding in best of 3 matches. Along the way, there's plenty of room for you to get lucky or your opponent to get unlucky. And how this really manifests is, often I see people going, well, my deck's not that good. I kind of have to get lucky here. I kind of just have to shove all the good cards in my deck and hope it works. With bad mana. As much as I think you should play good cards, I think fundamental solid deck building still really matters. Have that reasonable curve. Have castable, functional mana. Have a functional mana base. That's incredibly important. A fine deck with a decent curve, good interaction, good creatures like I've been talking about, is still going to win a percentage of the time, and a meaningful percentage of the time, against that deck with the Sanctuary Warden. Maybe you're not favored, but you're probably more favored than if you just try to like go like, okay, well, my deck's going to be bad anyways. Let me just try to shove in all the good cards and get lucky. I think that's a super, super common thing I see. Big mistake, I think. I think you really just want to employ good deck building fundamentals, honestly. I think that's a huge thing. For example, here's a card, Cut Your Losses. 4 blue, sorcery, casualty 2. Target player mills half the library rounded down. I think it's very easy to look at this bad card and go, well, I could put this card in my deck that's otherwise lacking in win con, and maybe I can get lucky, mill my opponent out, and, you know, they just, like, I set up things perfectly. I don't think you should be putting a card like Cut Your Losses, which is just, like, a really rancid card to put in your deck in most spots in that deck just because you think you need to get lucky with that, right? And I'm sure there's a bunch of analogs I could go through the set and say, this is a bad card, but don't, but maybe I can make it work or something. Again, I'm going to say this again. Just play the good cards. Just play the good cards. Play a good, clean, fair game of Magic. Don't try to mise someone because you think your pool isn't good enough. I should also say, so chat's pointed out here that there is actually best of 3 on day 1. You can have the option to play best of 3 or best of 1. My mistake on that. So everything I said about sideboarding is actually relevant. So that's nice. I think, personally, I will be playing best of 1 just because the math works out in a way where it's easier to qualify for best of 1. But if you feel like you want to play best of 3, that is an option. Okay, let's talk about some new Capenna specifics now. So one of the big things that I've noticed in my games, and I think probably the biggest thing, is that you have a little bit more breathing room in Sealed than you do in Draft. And I touched on this, but what this means is I can feel comfortable playing a tap land on turn 2 and turn 3 sometimes. I feel okay when my turn 2 play is, exile my Spar's Adjudicator to fix my mana. You have just half a turn or a turn more to get your footing under you, right? So just go in with that expectation. You're going to be able to make your mana work, have time to find that mana. It's going to be okay. Don't feel like you're going to get run over. Now, again, there's going to be some times where your opponent is pressuring you and playing 2 drops. Then you have to adjust a little bit. But the expectation, I think, going in is you're going to have a little bit of time, meaning you can push your mana just a little bit. That also means that if you feel like, should I include this good 4 drop or this good 3 drop? Maybe it's your last cut in your build. Maybe push towards the slightly more expensive but more powerful card. In Draft, one of the big things I've been talking about is 2-color decks are better than 3-color decks. That's kind of the story of this format, right? That you really want to try your best to be in 2 colors rather than 3. I think 2 colors can come together in this format. I've had quite a few good 2-color decks, both blue-white and green-white. Those are all the decks in the format, really. What other decks are there? But those are the most common 2, I find. It's not the default, though. I do think that the default is you are 2 colors in a splash, or 3 colors, or even 4 or 5 colors. I think very often you're going to be a multicolor pile that's just playing all those best cards. And going back to one of my original points, I do think that is probably better, being kind of like a multicolor pile, than trying to be some sort of streamlined deck that has bad cards in it. And when I say streamlined deck, I'm talking about streamlined mana, where you have cleaner mana, but bad cards, bad curve filler cards. So it's going to be, I think most pools are pretty clear if you have that 2-color deck or not. Sometimes you do have the option. Sometimes I've been like, okay, I have a good 2-color green-white deck or a 3-color Maestros deck that I could play with some rares. I've got like a Hostile Takeover. I've got maybe a Jund rare, a Riveteer's rare that I could splash in there as well. And you kind of have to decide which one is better. I can't really tell you here, honestly. It really depends case to case. One of the cool things about Seal is that every single pool is a puzzle. It's very much like, well, my pool is going to be... I'm never going to see the same pool twice. There's going to be similarities, but, the exact intricacies are very much going to be pool to pool and left up to the player to decide which one is better. I just want to put forth that both of the things are options. Both 2-color decks and 3-color decks are options. Don't be afraid to play more colors. I think if you've been drafting this set a lot, you might kind of have a little bit of a fear of playing more colors. Put that fear aside just a little bit. While, again, being conscious about your mana, making sure you can still cast your cards at some point reasonably. One other thing about this format that I found is you want to have a few good ways to answer bombs. Those nutty bombs that you're going to face. Like I said, you're going to face them more often than you will in Draft because people are going to have access to more packs, and those are the things that are drawing them into the colors they're playing. That means that cards like Buy Your Silence go up a little bit. I'm not saying a lot, but if you have not a ton of catch-all interaction, card like Buy Your Silence, which is the 5 mana, exile something, they make a treasure. That is a fine include in your deck. Disdainful Stroke is really good, actually. This is one that's a huge winner. This is the 2 mana counter target spell with 4 mana, or mana value 4 or greater. This one is actually just a really clean answer to some of the best cards in the format. Pretty good against interaction spells as well. Anything that can permanently get rid of something. Now, here is another difference between draft and sealed. I was just talking last week on the podcast about Run Out of Town and Out of the Way. These cards that get it something off the battlefield for a turn, but it comes back, right? You know, the Run Out of Town, they can put their card on top of their library. Out of the Way, it bounces the creature. And I was talking about how I think a lot of players don't view these kind of cards as real removal spells because it doesn't get rid of them permanently. In sealed, I actually think that Run Out of Town and Out of the Way are worse cards. Not bad cards, but get a little bit worse because so much of the time, you're going to want to point your interaction spell at that Wild Bomb they have, that Sanctuary Warden, that Titan of Industry. And yeah, you don't want them to be able to put it back in their hand or put it on top of their deck. Also, again, because you're not going to be out-tempoing your opponent all that often, you're not going to be able to take advantage of the Run Out of Town, bounce your blocker, attack all, attack all. Gonna happen some games. It's not a card I'm going to shy away from putting in my deck, but if I don't have, say my interaction suite is just bounce spells and Run Out of Town, I will be a little bit more likely to play that Buy Your Silence or that Disdainful Stroke in my deck because I don't have that. I can answer anything, kind of front cover. I need to be able to actually get something off the battlefield for good. Another big picture point here is that red is just mostly bad. I've done quite a few pools at this point, both like draft sims and, like I was saying, I've done some myself, done some with other people. I don't think I've been base red more than once. A lot of the red commons in this set are just not good sealed cards. And they're not great draft cards either, to be honest, right? If you go through them, there's a lot of junk. There's a lot of like the Gold Hound, Sticky Finger, even like Plasma Jockey, which is like a fine card in draft if you're in red, is, just not as good. I think you can have a decent red aggro deck if that's what you're the best card in or the best deck in your pool is. Like, that's, not ideal, but you can do that. I think just, you wouldn't be too wrong if you just shoved all the red cards into, I'm not going to look at these for now. Now, there's good red multicolored cards. Stuff like Corpse Appraiser, that's a great card, obviously. You're going to put red mana in your deck in some of your pools. But I just think it's very rare to have red as your base color, and I think that should just be your baseline. Don't think you're going to be drafting or putting a bunch of red cards in your deck. Even a card like Strangle, which is probably red's best common, single red mana, deal 3 to something, that's a card that isn't as good in sealed because it doesn't answer all the problematic things you need to answer. I mean, it's a fine card. I would play it, but it's not like tippity top, ooh, this draws me into red. And the last big picture point here about, format specific is lands are enablers, but they're also payoffs. So what I mean by this, I'm talking specifically about these sacrifice lands, Skybridge Towers, the ones that come in taps, tap for a color of any mana, and then sack for 4 mana, draw a card. Your lands are going to be a big part of when you're building your pool. You're going to say, okay, what fixing do I have? What cards can I reasonably play in my deck? And those enable your good cards. But it also is kind of this two-way street where these cards are great because they give you some flood insurance in your mana base. And in draft, you often don't sacrifice your Skybridge Towers or whatever. Like, the games just don't go that long. Like, you're going to do it some amount of the time. The games go long. But in sealed, you actually do sack them a lot of the time. You find the games do come down to a grind, and having 3 sacrifice lands in your deck when your opponent doesn't is a really large advantage. So almost view those lands as like pulls into the color in a way. And like I said, it works both ways where you want them in your deck to cast those spells, but they do actually do a really good job of helping you make sure the gas keeps flowing in the late game. Okay, so I'm going to move on to something I'm calling the default decks. I think one of the tough parts about sealed is, unlike draft, if I tell you how to draft this format, and I'm just like last week, I was doing the state of the format address episode, talking about the best decks. I can very easily tell you, blue-white's great, green-white's great. Here are the decks. There's black-red sacrifice. There's maestros. I can tell you all the decks. You could go on any website or video and look up the archetypes. It's a lot trickier for sealed because every pool is different. Every pool is unique. it's not as easy to just jump in and be like, okay, well, this is what my deck is doing, right? You really have to do some tricky sealed building. You have to do some finagling of your pool. But I do think over, on an average, there are what I would call default decks in this format. And there's default decks in any sealed format where there's maybe 3 or 4 decks that you should look for in your pool when you first open your pool to see if you have it. So I'm just going to go through these quickly, but the ones that I think are most common are green-white. I've just found green-white to be a good 2-color deck. This can come together. Sometimes it's just green-white. Sometimes it's green-white with another color. Splashing blue, splashing red. That happens sometimes. Depends on how many rares you have that you may want to splash. And it's just one of the better 2-color decks that I would classify as a good aggro deck if you can have it. Or good, maybe not aggro deck, but good proactive deck. And if you actually look, I actually did a quick search on 17 lands before this, where if you filter by sealed and see what decks people are building or submitting, green-white is far and away the best or the most common 2-color pair in pools. I'm not exactly sure what makes people play some of that more than blue-white, for example, which I think, is equally as good in my mind in draft. Like, what exactly are the factors there that make people play green-white cards over green-blue cards? Blue-white cards. Not exactly sure. To be fair, blue-white is the next most commonly drafted 2-color pair, or most commonly submitted sealed 2-color pair. So, not exactly sure the details there, but worth noting that, like I said, I've had a lot of pools that have looked like this, and so have other people, apparently, according to 17 lands. Blue-white, I think, is the secondary default thing. See if you have just the flyers, the select seal regulators, inspiring overseers, of course. Those are great, but those are great anywhere. I think the density of good blue-white gold cards plays a big part here, where you're just going to open a pool with, 4 gold cards. You've got some celestial regulators, you've got some metropolis angels, you've got some exotic pets, you got some stuff going on there. Just good blue and white cards in the format. There's a lot of them. They tend to take up a lot of sealed pool real estate, just like the green and white cards. They're going to happen to take up, there's just more good green and white cards than there are, the other colors of red and red black. And, maybe green is the tertiary one in there, but there are some pretty good green cards as well. So I think just like draft, these are the decks that are going to come together quite a bit. And then brokers, of course. If you don't have the clean blue-white or green-white, you can be 3 colors as well. I think that's pretty common, and brokers is a common thing. And then the last thing, like I was mentioning, the big, the most common thing, or one of the most common ones, are just piles, multicolored piles. And I think the multicolored piles look a little bit too different from one another to really categorize them here. I could probably, if you really wanted to go deep, tell you, well, you're more often like this base, your green-white base, splash a bunch of things. That can happen sometimes. But I think what I would do going through my sealed pool is just go, do I have the green-white deck? No. Do I have the blue-white deck? No. Do I have a broker deck? Maybe. Maybe it's not there. Let's see if those decks aren't there. Let's see if I can build some sort of multicolor pile. I think that's often been my quick and dirty way of thinking about it. Okay, so to close out here, I want to talk about some big winners. So some cards that get a lot better in sealed compared to draft. So, number 1, like I mentioned, the family fixers. The cycle of 3-color commons that fix your mana are large creatures. They're good for 2 reasons. They fix your mana and they are large. They are cards that matter. I like these. I like playing them. Masked Bandits is the one I think that is probably the worst, just because it's not that hard to block, right? Your opponents are going to have larger creatures on average than they would in draft. So, like, your 6-mana 5/5 Menace Vigilance creature, just gets double blocked, and maybe you even only trade for 1 creature. But all the rest, I think, are just pretty solid cards. Even Shattered Seraph, this is the 7-mana 4/4 flyer. It's just a card I'm happy to put in my deck. It's not premium by any means, but unlike draft, where I'm unhappy to put in my deck, I am happy to put this on. Extract the Truth. So I'm sure a lot of people don't even know what this card is. So this is 1 and a black for a sorcery. Choose 1. Target opponent reveals their hand. You may choose a creature, enchantment, or planeswalker card from it. That player discards that card. And the secondary mode here is target opponent sacrifices an enchantment. So this card is I would call it fairly main deckable. I'm not dying to play it or anything, but I found it pretty good because it deals with bombs, right? Just not first and foremost, but also there is 2 cycles of bomb enchantments in this format. Now, maybe that's a bit, they're not entirely truthful, because many cards in those cycles are not good. So there is the cycle of ascendancies. There is Broker's Ascendancy. Obviously, there's 1 or 2 ascendancies in there that maybe are slightly playable in sealed. And then there's the hideaway cycle with rabble rousing and fight rigging, even wiretapping. I think is somewhat playable in sealed. You're gonna see these cards. You're gonna see these cards, and they're gonna be problems. They are going to be cards that you're gonna want to nab. You're gonna want an answer for, and also you also have the advantage of knowing your opponent's hand. That matters a lot, right? Knowing they have a trick or a kill shot or a deal for what's it called? The deal for game 2. Yeah, they could have a knockout blow. Having that information is big game too. And of course, and Answer is an Elspeth. Answer is a All-Seeing Arbiter. Answer is a Titan of Industry. This is a card that goes from a 0 in draft to pretty solid in my sealed pool, and I wouldn't be sad about making this card making my deck. You don't want multiples, but one is good, and especially post board if you are playing best of 3. Disdainful Stroke, I talked about this one already. 2 mana, counter target spell with mana value 4 or greater. Just a good answer to some of the more important cards in the format. Paragon of Modernity. So this one is not amazing. It is a 4 mana colorless creature, 2/2 flyer, 3 mana. The Paragon gets +1/+1 until end of turn. If exactly 3 colors of mana were spent to activate the card, it gets a +1/+1 counter instead. Kind of just a card that I'm more willing to play in sealed, because the problem with this card is often it's just, you play it on turn 4 and you have to block with it. You're under a lot of pressure. It is a card that, I'm sure you've had draft games where it takes over because it's gone a little bit longer. And that's going to happen a little more often in sealed. I don't think this is a card you're actively looking to play in your deck, but if you are short on creatures that matter, creatures that close out the game, this is definitely a stand-in that you can play. Capenna Express. This is another one that kind of falls in that same camp. 4 mana, 6/6 vehicle, crew 3. You can sacrifice a treasure. Capenna Express becomes an artifact creature until end of turn. So this one's interesting because it's just a large creature that, again, your opponent has to respect in some regard. It also doesn't get hit by a lot of the interaction spells, right? It doesn't get hit by the pacifism. Doesn't get hit by anything sorcery speed. This is a card that I've faced myself and been like, man, that actually matters, and I have to deal with that thing. Or your opponent, you leave it back on blocks, and your opponent really can't get through it. So, again, not a card I'm thrilled to play, but totally a playable card, I think, in your sealed decks. And then, last of all, like I mentioned, the kind of card advantage cards, Case the Joint, and Demons Do, good filler cards. I would consider, the cards I was just talking about, Capenna Express and Paragon, again, more filler cards than anything, but once you're trying to fill, you've got your threshold of I've got to 17 good cards in my deck. The last 6 can be filled with these kind of cards here, when they're not embarrassing. Okay, so last thing here, I just want to talk about sorting your pool just quickly. So I talked about the first thing you want to do, separate your good cards from your bad cards. Leave those bad cards in the sideboard. Now, you might come back to the bad cards. Sometimes those bad cards they fill a niche where it's okay, I need some 2s. So I play some really bad 2s. I play a Civic Gardener or 2 to make sure I have something to do before turn 3. Because I think, your curve can be shifted a little bit. It shouldn't be shifted by a ton, right? You still need something to do, something to be able to double spell on some turn, right? Ideally, it's a cheap card that does something in the late game, something like more akin to a Broker Veteran, right? The 2 mana 1/2, 2 mana 2/1 that makes a shield counter when it dies. But if you need a curve filler and the rest of your deck is very good, sure, you might put that in. Anyways, you're gonna be sorting from good cards, the good cards and the bad cards. Put those in 2 piles, and then just trying to put together 2 decks, right, or 2 color pairs. Figure out your splash afterwards. Often, the way I put it is you want to sort your pool into what your best color is and what your deepest color is, right? And often you're going to be playing those 2 together as your base colors. Your deepest color just offers you decent playables, and your best color maybe has some bombs in it. Those are often going to be your 2 pairs or your two base colors, and you go from there. You kind of maybe splash some gold cards, splash some powerful cards, splash some things that fill some holes. Maybe you need some removal, something like that. It's a lot of kind of playing around with your pool, I find, because it's very much a multicolor, good stuff space you're working in a lot of the time. You kind of take some cards out, you maybe take some green cards out, you put some green cards back in, figure out, maybe I don't want to be a white base, I want to be a green base. There's a lot of kind of tinkering going on. And again, I don't have a great checklist of do this. But that's how I've kind of been moseying through my pool. And again, sometimes you do have those good 2-color pools. Those are going to come out. You're gonna see, okay, I've got this good green and white deck. This can just be on my base. But when you're building those multicolored pools, it's going to be a lot of tinkering, I find. build a lot of pools if you can. Build multiple pools. I know not everybody has infinite time, but it's not a timed event, right? You just join the sealed event and they give you your pool and you can build as long as you want. If you can, don't just go with your initial build. Go with build something, maybe show it to somebody if you can. And if you don't have anybody to show it to, I would recommend just stepping away. Stepping away for a second, 5 minutes, come back to your pool and go, do I like this still? Because sometimes you won't. Sometimes you'll actually be like, oh, why is that there? Or maybe you get a bit of clarity after you've stepped away for a second. That happens to me a lot. So build your first pool, take 5 minutes, get a snack, go to the washroom, come back, build another. Sometimes there's not going to be multiple builds. Sometimes you're like, this is the clear build of my pool. But in some pools, there's going to be quite a few. And then, of course, you can edit your build after you play. This is not a event where you submit it and you have to build with whatever you did the first round. After your first game, I would really recommend just going through and going, hey, my mana, maybe I need another island here. I feel like, I'm a little bit low on blue sources. Or going, okay, this card wasn't so good. It doesn't work in the context of my deck. Let's swap that out for something else. After you play the deck, even the best players, it's really difficult to submit the right 40 right away. And playing with the deck, even through one game, can really, really help to go, okay, I can see now this is not the best option. Maybe you thought you were light on early game and you actually have enough early game. You want a bit more expensive stuff. Just go through it. It's very easy to, after you've played your first game, maybe you've won and you've gone, okay, like this deck's great. I can just keep going. Or maybe you've lost and you're like, oh, just get back in the queue, play again. It's very easy to just rush into your second game. Don't just rush into your second game. Go through, look again, see if there's anything you want to switch out. And that's it. That's all I have to say for today. Chat, I'm going to send it to you. Send me any questions you have. As always, I want to thank everybody for hanging out. Really appreciate everybody here live on Twitch. We'll send it to the floor to talk to chat about any questions they might have. Once again, Patreon is out there on the screen here. If you want to check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. That's the place you can go if you want to support the show. Okay, first question. Secret says, what do you think about Big Score? So this is the 4 mana, red card, discard a card, you draw 2 cards, and you make 2 treasures. So the problem I have with Big Score, of course, is that it's kind of this glue piece that holds your deck together, ostensibly. That's what it kind of aspires to do. But you want your glue pieces often to be in your main colors, and red is often not a main color. Like, if you end up in a place where you do have red as your main color, or a lot of red sources, it does the Demons Do Case the Joint thing well enough, I would say. But it's not a card I think I'm all that interested in. Like, I guess you could also say, well, I've got 3 big scores. This enables some sort of, like, weird splish splash going on here where I can play just more of my good cards. That is probably a place I'm more interested in it, where Big Score might be a good reason to have, 7 mountains in your deck because it lets you play all your other cards. I would still say that seems like kind of a dubious plan, though, because that's like, putting 7 mountains in your deck is still going to be kind of a cost because you're going to have to fill your deck out with other red cards. So I don't love it. I don't hate it. You could play it if you have enough red sources and you want both those roles filled of some amount of card draw or filtering and some fixing. Are there any draft heroes that aren't good in sealed? Mostly no, I would say. So the big class of cards, like I was saying through the entire episode here, is just the 2-drop curve filler cards. The broker veteran is the one I keep talking about, but I think there's a lot of them I could bring up where it's like, yeah, you just you don't need this card. It's fine. Like, I would say, so a good rule of thumb is maybe before you have to put bad 2-drops in your deck, think of what number of good 2-drops, or what's the lowest number of good 2-drops you can have, and that number's probably like 3 or 4. Like, if you've got 4 cards that you can cast before turn 3, or 5 maybe, then you don't have to play the bad cards. If you don't have that, maybe you do have to play, like I was saying, the kind of Civic Gardener, those kind of cards in there. Past that, though, there's not a ton. I think most of the cards that are good in draft are just good in sealed. I don't think this set, the way it plays out in sealed, is all that different, aside from being slightly bigger, slightly slower. So, no, nothing sticks out to me. Nothing is jumping off the page. I'm just looking at the set spoiler here. I don't think so. I think most of your evaluations will carry over. Thoughts on sideboarding into a different second deck in best of 3 to throw off your opponent's sideboarding plan if you have a good second deck? Well, I wouldn't do it just to do it. Like, the reason you want to side into a secondary deck is because you believe it matches up better against your opponent's deck than the deck that you chose to submit first and foremost, right? Like, I don't think the equity you get often of surprising your opponent is worth playing a worse deck. I think you chose your main deck for a reason. Play that main deck. Now, if you have other reasons to switch into that deck, the classic one being you are both controlling decks and you don't feel like your controlling deck is good enough in the late game and you want to get, try to be a little more aggressive, get under your opponent, that's a fair enough reason. But I don't know how much my opponents are even going to sideboard. Maybe they'll sideboard a lot. Maybe their pool is such that they can't sideboard that much. I think you're going to be next leveling yourself a little too much of the time if you do that. Can you speak to any issues that may arise when your deepest and strongest colors are not allied? Is this an issue? It's not that much of an issue. No, I mean, the biggest issue there is, okay, so zooming out a little bit, a bigger issue when you're trying to pair your deepest colors with your best color is that you don't have the lands to support that. Now, if it's just a 2-color deck and you can get away with, hey, I just have a bunch of monocolor, like some, good black and white cards, sure, maybe that's not an issue. But if you're at all splashing a third color, you have some, land, you have some good, green cards in there, it's going to be tough for the mana base to support that. So you might instead want to be base green-white splashing the black cards if you can do that, right? That is where the issue arises, mostly in your mana base if you're splashing a third color. That's kind of a you've got to assess your situation, make a judgment call. How much am I giving up in my mana base? Like, if you've got a few fixers, you've got the Riveteer's land that does fix for, black and green. Maybe you've got some family fixers that can, fix you for black and green. I guess that's just the Riveteer's one as well. Like, if you can get away with just being green, white, or white, black base, splashing some green, because that's the way that makes most sense for your pool to operate. Like, your best colors are white and black. Again, assess that situation. But that will be an issue you run into. I don't know if there is a great remedy to it. Again, sealed pools are very unique. They're very, no two sealed pools are exactly the same. You're going to have an easier time in some sealed pools solving that problem than you are in others. But I guess, as you're building, just kind of know that might be a natural issue you run into. More of a tournament question. How do you center yourself during these events? Getting tilted/anxious during these high-stakes games seems like a recipe for disaster. Yes, totally. So, I think I've spoken with a few really, really good players about this on the show. If you want to go back and see some previous sealed episodes, if you want some thoughts about this, a little bit more in depth. But some just quick thoughts here. One, I can't recommend enough taking breaks in between all of your rounds. Doesn't have to be a long break, a 5-minute break. I would suggest a longer break as you get further up in the ranks, right? As you're like, okay, I'm going for my last one. Take a walk around your block. I do this all the time when I'm playing. Doesn't have to be a walk around your block. Take a walk, down your stairs or up your stairs, or just touch some grass. Like, it's really, really important to not carry the last game's anxieties into the next game, and that's a very common thing that can happen. You're like, wow, that was a sweat. Like, I just narrowly got out of that last game, or even worse, you lost the last game. You're carrying that with you. You really, really want to separate whatever happened in the last game from your next game. That's my biggest tip I can give you. And of course, all the general, tournament prep stuff, like make sure you have eaten, make sure you're not running on empty, hydrate yourself. That's a big thing. But yeah, my biggest tip is take some breaks. Any thoughts on playing with or around board wipes in Sealed? Apologies if this come up. Yeah, so there are quite a few board wipes in this set. Not a lot of them are awesome, though. There's Hostile Takeover, which is, a bomb. That's the Grixis Wrath. That card is ridiculous. Sure, you should probably consider that if your opponent is playing Grixis colors. Then there's Depopulate, there's Corpse Explosion, there's a few other things in there. So, I have found, and this is similar to Draft, and maybe even more so in Sealed, where aside from Hostile Takeover, where my opponent wraths, and then they have a really good creature on board, and like I'm really far behind, I found often in this set, both in Sealed and Draft, that my opponent wraths, and I go, all right, that was okay. Like, that was a little bit annoying, but I've still got a card in hand. Like, they often need to wrath before, you empty your entire hand. So you still have a few cards in hand, or you've gotten some amount of value, or especially in sealed, you have cards in your deck that can catch you up from getting wrath. You've got card draw, you've got more expensive cards in your deck. So yeah, it's certainly a concern. You should certainly think about it. You should keep it on your radar. If you're very far ahead, don't play into it. That's actually probably a good point to mention. The difference between being very far ahead and being slightly ahead. I think this is a place that you can trip up a little bit, where you can kind of next level yourself and go, well, I'm kind of ahead here, and I don't want to get wrath, so I won't play my other creature. But you're only so far ahead that you would get, if your opponent has an interaction spell or a psychic pickpocket, something that stabilizes the board and bounces something, or a Spurs Adjudicator, something like that stabilizes them just as well, and that's an out to them being behind, and you're like, well, I didn't play around that, right? Like, my plan of keeping something back actually hurt me here, because I would have had lethal if I just played into it. So, play around the commons and the uncommons more than the rares, I think is just generally a tip. But, just kind of take in your level of how far ahead or behind you are. Playing with them is tough. I would say don't hold on to them for too long. Pull the trigger when you need to pull the trigger. Don't expect to get every single card out of your opponent. Think of them more as a tempo play, as okay, I've stopped their board for a little while. They're going to probably rebuild some way, but I'm not under a ton of pressure. Especially a good opponent is not going to play into the wrath 100%. You're not going to get all their cards, and they're going to go, you're going to wait that extra turn and be like, okay, I could probably get one more card out of them. And they just don't play another card because they're like, I've got 3 creatures on board. I don't need to play another one here. You've got no creatures. Don't be too gun-shy about firing off the wrath when you have one. Does green red get better in sealed? No, I don't think so. Part of the problem with green red in draft and sealed is that the cards are just bad. And I'm talking on average here. The thing about sealed is that you open what you open. And if you open a bunch of good green and red cards, yeah, you play a green-red deck. Sure. But that's not going to happen that often. So yeah, it can be better than your average draft deck. I think that is certainly true. But I don't think there's anything structurally about green-red that makes me like it better than in sealed than in draft. That's actually another thing I should point out too, or just touch on, is that don't let your biases carry over too much from draft into sealed when you're talking about card evaluation. If you just have a good green-red deck, play that good green-red deck. Don't be like green-red is bad. If your green-red deck is all good cards, play that green-red deck. Don't just think, okay, I know green-red can't win in draft very often, so I shouldn't play it in sealed. Play the best deck in your pool. Don't have some arbitrary reason not to. That being said, it's not going to be often that green-red is the best deck in your pool. Do you skimp on sources when splashing in sealed? 7 sources for a main color or 2 sources for a splashed fight rigging? It depends. So, one of the things that really matters as far as sources go is your velocity. The rate that you see cards at. This is the whole, card draw is fixing joke people often talk about, where if you can see your cards at a more accelerated rate, you have any card selection or stuff like Inspiring Overseer that you're going to naturally draw cards over the course of the game, you can probably get away with fewer sources, but I would mostly adhere to draft, just the fixing rules that you use in draft. Don't skimp too much. Maybe ever so slightly you can get away with it because things are a little bit slower, but I wouldn't weigh that too heavily when you're making any building decisions. Just whatever constitutes as a good mana base in sealed is pretty similar to the good mana base in draft. Now, sometimes out of necessity, you just don't have the fixing, and to play your best cards, your mana base gets a little bit poorer. Like I was saying before, I would edge towards, or I would kind of lean towards better cards, worse fixing, rather than better fixing, worse cards. So that's kind of a distinction to make. But if you have the good fixing, try your best to hit your sources, hit those target source numbers. Do you like Ominous Parcel more in sealed than draft? Not really. It's still a third-rate fixer. So this is the 1-mana artifact that sacks to get a land, and then you can pay 5 to deal 4 to something. I think it's still pretty bad, but if you need it to hold your pool together, you could play it. Does having the mulligan punish more or less in sealed? Are you more likely to play 18 lands to avoid this or not really? So I'm more likely to play 18 lands in sealed for sure, especially because I might have somewhat of a sketchy mana situation where I am trying to fit all my best cards in, and I want to make sure I have enough sources. Often your 18th land will be better than your 23rd spell. I can tell you that. So yes, I often play closer to 18 lands. As far as mulligans go, I don't think I would, like, if my deck wants 17 lands, I'm going to play 17 lands. If my deck wants 18 lands, I'm going to play 18 lands. I don't think mulligans play a huge factor in that. I will say that mulligans generally hurt less in sealed because you have more time to make up the card disadvantage, and the clunk factor of a bad opening hand is greatly diminished because you don't get run over all that often. Now, mind you, I am still adverse to mulliganing. One of the things about this draft format is I actually have been mulliganing more often than I would in another draft format because I think you need to not stumble. In sealed, I would maybe push towards mulliganing a little bit more just because you can afford to go down a card, especially if your deck has other ways to catch up. Catch up on cards, that is. You have those card draw spells I was talking about. Endless Detour is the card that most overperformed in sealed over drafts by 17 lands. How do you see that? That's a great question. So Endless Detour is the blue, white, green instant that puts a card on the stack or a permanent or a card in the grave on top or bottom of the owner's library. They choose where to put it. So I don't know exactly. One thing is that 17 lands is pretty low sample size on sealed right now, but at the same time, like you are kind of alluding to here, most of the cards are about where they are in draft. Like, there's not too much of a difference. I will say, though, that I don't know how much stock I put into that currently. I guess enough. I'm kind of being wishy-washy here, but I think that on average, you're facing worse competition. Well, I know on average you're facing worse competition than a best of one for sure. Like 17 lands players will face worse competition in the draft leagues or the sealed leagues they have right now compared to best of one draft because it's not ranked. So I don't know how much accurate data or meaningful data you're going to get from that. Probably enough to that the Endless Detour being an outlier matters here. So I guess my thoughts here are, if I'm just like kind of spitballing here, one, being able to interact on the stack is pretty nice in sealed just because you have a little bit more time to, leave up mana, interact with their 6 mana creature. It does somewhat answer a Titan of Industry or a Sanctuary Warden, at least for a turn, because it's not like you need to interact with it. They don't get their ETB, right? It's kind of like a counterspell in that way. But also it's flexible as just an interaction spell to get something off the board for a turn if you need it. But also, because you tend to have more, like the top end of your deck is better. You've got the more high quality cards at your top end. The rebuy something from your grave mode of Endless Detour might come up a little bit more. Where you like put a card in your graveyard on top of your library. Like if they kill your Titan of Industry, putting that back with Detour is nice. And that's going to be something you're going to be able to do a little bit more often in sealed than draft, just because, again, more rares. But yeah, I don't have a fantastic answer, but that's kind of just my thoughts spitballing here. All right, I'm gonna pack it up, chat. Thanks so much. Really appreciate everybody hanging out here. We have got quite a few good shows coming up next few weeks. Sam Black is coming on soon, like I mentioned, should be the next few weeks. We're gonna probably shift a little bit away from Streets content into the more classic limited level ups episode content. We're gonna do. I've got some good level ups in the works here for big picture stuff, generic, stuff you can carry from format to format. Really appreciate it. Of course, this is going to be up on the YouTube. If you want to check out the visuals, I have a bunch of visuals for people that are listening in audio only. If you're somebody who follows along with visuals, it's going to be up there. The PowerPoint that I use on Twitch, you can see it there. Also, follow the Limited Level Ups YouTube feed. That's a great place to catch all these videos, all the draft videos that I post, all of the coaching videos that I post, a bunch of stuff up there. And yeah, that's it. All right. See ya, everybody. We'll see you next time.